Welcome to Our Leadership Journey. We are Mike Cloutier and Peter Januszewski, and our goal is to interview people leaders at different stages of their career, from frontline managers to CEOs, and extract the leadership lessons they've learned on their journey to help you become a better leader. On this episode, we have the thrill of speaking with Sheila Frame. Sheila is the current President Americas at Amryt Pharma, a global pharmaceutical company focused on novel treatments for rare diseases. She's a well-seasoned pharma executive, having led major functions in Canada, the US, and Europe across general management, marketing, and public affairs within companies such as Novartis, Bristol-Myers Squibb, and AstraZeneca. Prior to joining the pharmaceutical industry, Sheila worked as a professional communicator and lobbyist, holding senior positions within the Government of Canada and with the Canadian National Railways. In our wide-ranging conversation, we covered the importance of a personal board of directors, benefits of sharing personal learnings across an organization, how mindfulness practice can help your ability to lead, and the number of careers you should have in your lifetime. So Sheila, we've got a bunch of questions for you, but why don't we start with Sheila, where you're at right now and what you're up to right now in your leadership journey?
Sure. So happy to be here and looking forward to our conversation today. I'm currently leading the Americas region. So that includes Canada, the US, and LATAM. So Latin America, we have businesses in Argentina, in Colombia, and in Brazil. And I lead an organization that's pretty new. It's only a 6-year-old pharmaceutical company that's entirely focused in rare and ultra-rare diseases. So it's my first endeavor into that space, having come from some pretty big areas, although mostly in specialty care type areas. But this is my first in rare and ultra-rare diseases, where you kind of get to know every one of the patients who are taking your medication because it's such a small community. So in a market like the size of the US, one of our areas that we focus on only has about 300 patients in the entire 350 million patient population potential in the US. So a much, much different experience for me as a leader in terms of this kind of approach to the market.
Wonderful.
Yeah. So Sheila, you've had leadership roles at varying levels in organizations, different businesses and types of organizations, and both in the US and Canada. So I'd like to maybe...
And Scandinavia.
And Scandinavia. So, I think I want to ask a couple questions around those things. So first of all, if we think about your leadership journey from the earliest days to where you are today, even though your scale and scope may have actually become smaller in some ways, but you went from probably somewhat small to bigger to smaller. I'd like to have you describe sort of your learnings about that, and then we'll come back to the different countries.
Geographies, yeah. So, Mike, that's such an interesting question, because I've been in really big pharma, really small, privately held pharma where, we had to go meet the royal family in Belgium in order to get our funding. And they asked me, I remember the first time they asked me for a 10-year plan, I thought they were kidding, having come from a quarter to quarter version. I think, really big is definitely not my thing. I think I really love the small company approach where you can get to know people and you get to know their names on a first name basis, and it's much more collegial that way. So I think that for me was something that I needed to snack on and try different experiences. But I'm also very much someone who will roll up my sleeves and get my hands dirty, which is really important. So one of the companies I was at, for example, we used to track when we were hiring people from bigger organizations, and we had like a 50% failure rate on recruitment. That's pretty tough, right? Because it's expensive to recruit people. And we really dove into it. And I think the advantage, and certainly I'll talk about Canada and what it did for me in terms of my career and why I think it's so important. I think the smaller organizations mean that you get great breadth. And you have to be able to do everything, and you get a line of sight into everything. In large organizations and in larger geographies like the US, you tend to be very deep and very narrow. And I think both of those things is, important in terms of how you develop and grow and the different experiences that you have. But I certainly favor the big picture and the strategic thinking. And I think that's what you get in some of the smaller geographies. One, you have to get your hands dirty because there's nobody else. Like everyone's pointing at you, going, "Can you get it done? And how do you do it?" I also think it makes you, I would say, more strategic in the context of prioritization because you don't have the resources either to do everything. So I think those are some of the things that I learned as I grew. I also think in some of those socialized medicine countries where price increases, haven't been a thing for my career, you have to learn how to grow the market and or grow your share. So that sort of skill of stealing share, creating the value in the minds of the physician and creating that connection with patients, I think is just harder than, maybe looking at annual price increases as we have in the US.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. If you think about your journey, were there times when you started to formulate a sense of the things that you really wanted to focus on and be better at and things that you were going to just kind of let be almost average?
Well, I think there's probably a couple of moments that I would say kind of spring to mind when you ask that question. I mean, the first one was actually working with you when you had us all read Good to Great and focus on level 5 leadership. And that was probably the first time where I was like, wow, am I ever going to get there? That kind of picture, at least I think that description gives a pretty clear picture of what good looks like, right? So it probably started there. When we were launching Opdivo and Yervoy, and I was at Bristol-Myers Squibb, they brought in a program called the Energy Project. And it was such an intense time, right? Because at that point, we were going to be launching 12 indications in less than 18 months. Like, who does that, right? I mean, nobody in our industry had done that before. And they brought in this sort of approach to help us understand that it wasn't about managing your schedule or the hours in the day. It really was about managing your energy. And if you don't self-manage and self-regulate, how can you possibly lead a team and help them to manage, right? So that was a moment where I think was probably one of the first times where I gave myself permission to say, I'm not going to do it all today. So I realized like 24 hours, didn't matter how hard I worked, I was never getting to the end of the inbox. So I kind of, but that was really hard. Mm-hmm. And then a little bit later, I read this book called Sink, Float, or Swim, and it integrated all of the components of sort of managing your energy. And you choose every day, are you sinking? Are you floating? Are you going to actually swim? And are you actually training for high performance? And that has had a pretty profound impact on me late in my career. I wish I'd had it earlier in my career to some extent, but because work always came ahead of, I'll put that aside, I'll do that later or whatever. I mean, of course, my family was always very important to me as well, but I used to draw the line. I have to be home to put the kids to bed. I didn't have to be there at dinner, but I had to be there to put them to bed and that kind of thing. And so work just kind of became all consuming for a while. And this particular book and training program, and there's an app for it and everything else, that has really helped me slow down and be very focused and help me prioritize instead of that sort of, many of us in our industry, I think, tend to like to serve others. We're very much people pleasers. I think that's probably one of the most common traits that I've come across. We have a bunch of really high achievers, many of whom tend to be insecure. And I certainly was for a long time in my career, insecure, always trying to do better, do more, do extra. What else can we do? That kind of thing, push forward, all of that drive that we have, to kind of step back and say, okay, what are those moments that are going to give me the greatest leverage or give the patient the greatest leverage or give our business the greatest leverage? And am I actually preparing for and training for those moments? So everything from movement to nutrition, to mindfulness, and then most importantly, probably is mindset, right? How do you actually train your mind to shift? And, I would say probably in the last 10 years, that's been a trick where, and I, use it as always, leadership's great when you have kids. I use it with my kids all the time saying, well, what else could be true? You're making all of these assertions and we have all of this stuff going on in our heads. Wow, I can't wonder what that motivation is. What are they motivated by? What's wrong with them? All that kind of stuff. Yeah. Then you step back and you go, wait a second, what else could be true? And so those kind of 4 key areas, I think more recently have helped me slow down. I think that's one thing, because I do tend to be a little bit quick off the mark, and reflect. And then I think, especially as I get more senior in my career, I've really started to focus in the last 3 years, I'd say, on learning meditation and mindfulness, and really focusing on trying to get out of my own head, and learning how to keep my focus. To your point, I can't have my phone either when I'm on Zoom calls, and really make sure that I'm putting the effort behind those few things that are going to make all the difference.
Yeah.
So Sheila, I really want to ask you about this. This was actually on my list of questions. I'm glad this already came up naturally. So what does your mindfulness practice look like? And 2, what have you seen as the benefits in terms of leadership? How has it benefited you or your team?
So the practice is interesting. I mean, every year I choose one word to set my sort of mantra for the year. And for the last 2 years, it's been begin again. So it's like, I love that. Okay, didn't do so well today. I'm going to begin again tomorrow. I do use a number of apps. I do find guided meditation much better for me than other approaches, at least for now. So I do have a number of apps that I use. The 10% Happier app is phenomenal. Awakened Mind is phenomenal. This guy from Australia who I've gotten to know quite well, I really like his app as well. So those are probably the 2. And then this Tignum approach that manages sort of nutrition, mindset. They have all kinds of tools and exercise and that kind of thing. So I use, those are probably the 3 key apps that I use. I do try to get at least 20 to 30 minutes every day. I'm usually by myself, and I go into a corner. I have a chair. I don't sit on a cushion in my closet or anything like that. But now, whether or not it's benefited me, I have to say my main motivation initially was when I saw the data on cognition with aging. So as I get older, my fear was, oh my God, if something happens to my ability to be cognitively alert, then I'm done. I have to be able to make a living and enjoy my life and all of that. So I started doing it more for that motivation, as a protection for cognition and to extend my brain matter as long as I possibly can. And so has it helped me? It probably has helped to reduce the adrenaline that we tend to get, and at least has, they say always, your mind lies, but your body doesn't. So when you're about to react, now I actually, and what it taught me, I was actually in Africa at this point, and we were in a very long meditation, a 90-minute meditation, which is not an easy thing to do. And a crow was crowing on the roof, scared me. It was the first time I actually felt the adrenaline release in my body and felt my body surge. And that was a really important moment with the mindful teacher that we had at the time, because he said, okay, now that happens to you probably 20 times a day and you're not even noticing it. Mm-hmm. And so getting the like that for me was a whole new enlightenment around self-awareness. Because if I can feel it in my body, then I can most of the time stop my mouth from opening.
Can you tell us about the importance of a personal board of directors?
Sure. So certainly something that, I learned early in my career. I don't know that I've been as formal as I've professed it to be, but it does help to have a group of people that you stay close to that can give you that honest advice. And I think most recently there was an article that I found really interesting where you have to make sure that you have different people serving different roles. So you want the honest feedback right off the bat. You want someone who's just the promoter, who's going to really help you when you're having, all of that self-doubt that we all have. And, sort of all of those different kind of roles in your life. I think it's probably one of the things that when you get to this stage in your career and you look back at the network that you've built and the people that you can just pick up the phone and call and stay connected with for all sorts of different reasons, and reach out to them just to stay connected and ask if you can help them, I think is really phenomenal. So I've, had a long chat with somebody recently who was like, how do I fire somebody who's on my board? Like, it's not really a formal position, just maybe don't ask them for advice about one thing or another. If you don't want to hear it, don't ask, So I love that part about, are you ready for the feedback? Like, do you really want to get this feedback? So make sure that you ask people. But it is important. And I think it's kind of related to just building a really good network, and making sure that you're clear when you're asking people what's your motivation? I mean, if you've got a blind spot, are you actually clear about who would you go to try to uncover, hey, am I missing something here? To help you with that. So I think it's really important.
Oh, that's wonderful. That's wonderful. I think the other phrasing I've heard around this topic before I saw this on your profile, the thing that I had in my head before was a mastermind. Like that's the word that I've had associated with having sort of peers that would challenge you. They're maybe in the same kind of space, maybe not, but people that would have a very genuine and authentic opinion of you, and you could give you some feedback that you might not get from people that are working with you directly, because that's a little bit that's tough, right? If you're my direct supervisor, it's a little dicey, and yeah.
I found it really helpful when I was in Scandinavia, because I was the general manager for the region, and I, didn't know anybody, didn't have any friends. We were living in Copenhagen, and I had a network across the organization outside of the region, but you're working with them, right? So it's still a business kind of relationship. And so I found a network that was across all industries of essentially business people who needed that kind of independent advice. And it really, really helped me. One, it connected me more quickly into the community, but also I had people who had no idea the situation that I was facing or if I was struggling. And to your point, right, being at the top is lonely, and I think that's the biggest fear you have, the more senior you are in the organization, that you're going to get what people think you want to hear rather than what you really need to hear. And that's probably the biggest risk that many of our CEOs, I think, face is, are they really getting the truth? And the vast majority of the ones that I've worked with want to get the truth. And they're not that close to the board sometimes, and the board's not that close to the business situation. So how do you actually go and solicit that kind of independent, feedback to help guide you, even if you're just kind of looking to spar a little bit with different ideas and different approaches? Because the tougher the decision making is that you have to make, and the less information you have and the more ambiguity you're facing, then the more it's helpful to have somebody to just verbalize, which, is what I have my husband for too. But
yeah. So it's a curious situation that I think everyone faces ultimately. But for you, how did it occur when you realized that you were strong enough to ask for the real feedback? Because there is, I think you mentioned earlier, and I know I personally felt, and Peter and I have talked about too, that there are those periods in your career, usually early on, but where you're not so sure of yourself that you're almost afraid to get the feedback because, like you said,
it hurts.
I actually do this?
Yeah.
Right? And how did that transition?
So I can blame you, Mike, because at one point, Mike moved me from head of public affairs and government affairs, where I was very much in my sweet spot, to head of marketing. And I had a bunch of people reporting to me who thought that I was completely useless. And, I had no idea. I had an MBA, but I didn't know if I could market to save my life. And it was probably like that transition from one function to another. I've subsequently done it a number of times because, you kind of get addicted to the thrill of the chase to see whether or not you can actually do it. Right. But there was some very lonely, hard moments to try to figure out, how can I lead these people and have them trust me, and how can I figure out how to help them when they know more about all of this than I do and than I ever will, really, right? And that's really the transition to general management. I think is, you've seen people who get these expat assignments and all of a sudden they have no idea of the language or the rules in the country or anything else and get themselves in trouble. But you have to figure out, how can you trust those professionals, but also know enough to ask the right questions. And, questioning is a skill that I really value and I admire it a lot. And I don't think I'm that good at it, but it's definitely an area that I continuously try to learn. And I watch people who are very skillful at it. And there's been a few leaders, and I've seen it on boards of directors as well, where they can create that environment to ask questions in such an innocent, non-threatening way that they can fulfill the sort of obligations, the fiduciary obligations to do due diligence, but without creating a dynamic of people feeling like they're threatened. And in some people, in some of companies in our industry have been, notorious for, it was sport, right? To try to humiliate people. They didn't know everything. And the senior leaders would sit there and you'd come in with your brand plan and you'd get, completely decimated. And that was fun for them and horrible for individuals and just continue to contribute to that lack of confidence. But when I watch people who are so skillful at creating that environment to ask questions, it's just something that I certainly admire, and I continuously try to practice it. And so I challenge myself now in meetings, especially when people are presenting, their business plans or whatever, to try and really identify where are they now and what is the one or two question I can ask that help them move forward in a way that builds confidence as opposed to ruining it. And that's really hard when you're moving quickly and, people want decisions made quickly and all of that. So you've got to kind of really work at that. And that's my ongoing development. It's to slow down enough to ask those questions. And it keeps you occupied, right? Because you got to try to figure out, okay, how am I going to formulate this?
And I think a great pivot point on this questioning is coaching. And I saw in your profile that you had given a recommendation to one of your prior colleagues, and you said that they were one of the best coaches you've ever interacted with. So certainly asking questions, I think, is a great part of coaching. What else do you think makes an excellent coach?
So it's interesting because I have had, a number of situations where I've been fortuitous enough, I think, to be given individual coaching external to the organization that I'm working in, if I'm working on something pretty specific to get that. But I do think the most important, at least for me, what I needed the most of was affirmation, because we sometimes lose perspective on where you are. And Mike probably did this the first time for me, was sort of trying to get a sense of the rest of the industry or other experiences. So when you're fairly new in your career, I mean, you're you and you have the people that are around you that you work with, but you don't necessarily have that perspective. And so I find that coaching for me was mostly that thought partner that, okay, help me, I'm going to try this. The person who's going to pick you up when you fail, right? Because you're ultimately going to fail, and let you know that it's okay, which is why I like Begin Again, because, you learn the most from the moments that suck. So, or Brene Brown, embrace the suck. So that's my latest right now. It's like, just embrace it. But I also think that it's those moments that bring you forward. So, hey, it's okay, and it's what we do with our kids as well. Hey, it's okay. You know what? You're going to get up and you're going to try again, and we're going to do it. And, when you watch kids when they're learning to walk or whatever, they fail all the time, right? And they just keep going. And I think that we also need to take some inspiration from that. There was a podcast this past weekend I was listening to where they said, 90% of adults, their biggest fear is to be shamed. It's like publicly shamed, right? And, it occurred to me, like, how are we set up organizationally we actually set it up, like it's kind of a setup, right? So how do we actually change our approach organizationally to make sure that we avoid that situation? And I think that's what coaching can do right now, because it tends to be more one-on-one. But we've also had situations where we've brought in leadership coaches to actually watch the dynamic in the team. Now, I do that in my current role as well, but I have somebody actually act as an observer. So they don't actively participate in the meeting one day, but they actually watch the team dynamic and then provide the feedback at the end, so that we're improving and we're all getting better at coaching that way. So I do think that it's that sort of, the hard feedback and reality, but at the same time with that reassurance that it's not the end of the world. You're going to recover from this and you're going to learn from it.
I noticed that you shared this notion on LinkedIn, talking about sharing learnings across the organization. So I just wanted to know, Sheila, what does that look like and how do you enact that?
So in a couple of places I've had the privilege of doing I called it the Mistake of the Month Club, which was really hard to get people initially to engage in. But we actually pulled aside financially some budget for two reasons. One, to have people come up with the most innovative ideas, that we would have cash, sitting there to be able to fund it if they actually had an idea that we thought was gonna change things or learn from in particular. And knowing, like, eyes wide open as a leadership team, hey, this may not work. And then it basically forces the organization to visibly share what were the learnings, right? Because there's nothing worse than one person learning about something that they tried that didn't work and then never sharing it, because then the organization is doomed to repeat the same damn mistake. So I think that's really what the intention was. I also think, and this is a hard one, because especially the longer you're in the career, the more you relate to individuals where they are in their careers, especially people starting out. And you have a tendency to want to, oh, I did that, or I had that experience, let me tell you about it. And you're like, no, don't, right? That's not their reality. Like, listen, and then just ask those questions to get them to the next step. So it's kind of an interesting balance. I try to do it mostly around those big initiatives or those big ideas. And maybe it's because we're in this time, especially in the US, where everything's on the table in terms of healthcare. And, we have to change the system. Like, the system's really broken. And so nobody knows what the new way forward is. Nobody knows what our commercial model is going to look like in a post-COVID world. I don't know. And so we have to be approaching some of these things with that sort of childlike openness to say, oh, I'm going to give this a shot, and I'm okay if it doesn't work, right? As long as you're, everybody talks about mitigating risk and all of that. Well, okay, yes, let's mitigate the risk, but we still need to give it a shot. So, and it may fail. So I do think that it's really important that, that we do these kinds of things. So Mistake of the Month Club was a little bit tough. I tried to set it up with some of the leaders. Like, I wanted it to be more of a grassroots thing so that I wasn't directly part of it. So people don't feel, oh my God, right, the president's going to find out I screwed up. You try to make it grassroots, but it really comes to the culture that you create as a leader and as your leadership team creates, to really make sure that space. I mean, everyone's writing right now about, the safe space and a speak up culture and all of that kind of stuff. And, that's not something that you turn on overnight.
No.
The world right now is fundamentally different than what we all grew up with. And so, when I think about the future of leadership, I think it's totally going to be open to leadership at all levels and has nothing to do with position anymore. I'm not sure that it ever really did, but ever more so now as we, look at all of these different models that are being tried. One day you might be leading a team, but the next day you might be doing something that you never thought you'd be doing, right? And I think the world is open now. I think the recruitment process is wide open in a post-COVID world. I think for everybody who's struggling in the middle of an organization, I just think that it's just huge what the opportunities are. So I'm super excited about that, because I think I'm going to learn too. And, can imagine us all working for a very long time in different areas. And that's probably the one thing, when people ask me all the time, what regrets or what are your best experiences? I probably would have taken a lot more risks a lot earlier. And I've taken a lot of them. I mean, I've moved my family all around the world, and I've tried lots of different companies, and I've tried different positions, and I've been in different functions. But I probably would have started earlier, I think, now, because there's so much more that I could still do, that would be just kind of, I think, as you guys look at this podcast and hear from your listeners, I think just that sort of excitement about what the future might hold. I think the whole world's going to change in business now. And I think we have this, in spite of the devastation of the pandemic, I think it's created a whole different approach, or at least accelerated it.
Absolutely. Terrific.
It was lovely.
Thanks.
And it's crazy to hear you say that you should have taken more risks, given the changes that you've done in your career. And I think you'd posted something, there was an article or something you were talking about on LinkedIn about, you should have about 7 careers in your lifetime. Is that?
Yeah, that was a long time ago. I want to say it was like in the 90s, somebody came out and said you should have 7 careers. And I was like, okay, I'm going to try and get it done as fast as I can. I think I'm a little bit, well, it depends. I mean, jobs versus careers a little different, but yeah, I've definitely been a bit of an overachiever in that regard.
I was going to say, I would have thought that your immediate reaction was 7. I could do 8 or 9.
let's get into the rapid fire section of the podcast.
Yeah.
So, first question for you, Sheila. If someone wrote a biography of your professional journey to date, what would be the title?
I'm so glad you shared these with me before, because otherwise I'd be panic stricken right now. And I actually reached out to a few people on my board about how they would describe it. So we came back with trailblazer. So then I started thinking, and this will make Mike laugh, blazing saddles. I'm like, oh my God, that would be terrible. But I think this notion of, innovation and driving change, I think is definitely sort of what turns me on, is leading and driving change.
Brilliant. And Sheila, so if someone got the rights to this biography of yours and made a biopic, made a movie out of it, who would be starring in the lead role to play you?
So here's what came to mind. So, and I'm not that great with that kind of trivia, but what came to mind was kind of Aaron Brockovich, that whole kind of fighting the system. I am very grounded in justice and standing up for the little guy. And so I think it's something like that, like taking on the system. I will reform healthcare one day, like before I die. People ask me all the time, what job do you want? I want to be the head of Health and Human Services somewhere, or the Deputy Minister of Health in Canada at the end of my career. We got to fix this. Like, we have to get it right. Yeah. So that's what drives me.
Perfect. Next question. If you were going to write a theme song or an anthem for leadership, what would be the chorus line that you think should be repeated throughout, that is a sort of a critical lesson for leaders to be aware of?
So probably one of my grounding songs is The Climb by Miley Cyrus. So that whole sort of thing around, there's always going to be another mountain and I always want to move it. That's probably, just give it to me. I'll go for it. Like, let's take the hill. So,
there's a theme building.
Yeah, definitely.
Sheila, next question. What book or books have you most often gifted to new employees, or maybe even people in sort of your mastermind, your network?
Wow. So I have a big library. I think there was actually a skit done at one point when Mike and I worked together about how much I always had a book on my shelf. Oh, here, this will help. You could try this. So, as my career's changed and shifted, for sure, the sort of sink, float, or swim is a more current one. The 4 Obsessions of an Extraordinary Executive is one that I love. Mm-hmm. The 5 Temptations of a CEO, all by Patrick Lencioni. I really, really love all of those. Certainly, the sort of notion around Brené Brown and vulnerability and leadership and all of her writings certainly come to mind. So I have a bunch of them. Maxwell always has good stuff around teamwork, right? So it just depends on what problem I'm trying to solve. But I go back to many of them. In fact, the 4 Obsessions of an Extraordinary Executive, I keep on my Kindle and listen to it sometimes because it's a short read. And I never liked the 5 Dysfunctions of a Team. Everybody knows Lencioni for the 5 Dysfunctions of a Team. I always go, no. His better works are much more around the 5 Temptations of a CEO or the 4 Obsessions. So those are the ones that I like the best.
So Sheila, as a final question before we let you go, where can people find you? If they were to search you up online, where can people find things that you're posting on, thinking about?
Yeah, LinkedIn is probably the one that I use the most, right? So I don't do much other social media other than LinkedIn is probably my biggest one. So I usually try to put forward thought pieces, which right now it seems like people are yeah, LinkedIn's probably the easiest one.
So Sheila, thank you so much for joining us.
I hope
today.
it was helpful, you guys. Thanks so much for having me.
That was so good.
Okay.
Yeah.
All right.
It's always a pleasure to chat and to be able to have this conversation with you and share it with others is even more important. So thanks again.
Well, it's really good to see you and nice to meet you,
Pleasure
Peter. Thanks for your help.